Thanks to all of you for sharing your perspective. I'm looking forward to the Q&A. So we'll start with, I see Patricia, Leslie, Alex, and Kavita. And please do put your card up if I can be. I'm sorry. Oh, yours is still up. Okay, that's fine. Okay, so we'll start with Leslie. No, yours is down too. All right, Alex, you were next on the list.
Thank you very much. Have you found situations in which the countries, since some of you have been working in other countries, that the countries have shown any initiatives that would be scalable around the world? And I wanted also to have Dr. Bott explain one thing. I wasn't sure if this was specific to certain work you do or everything that PATH does. You spoke of global and clinical trial insurance, and I gathered that the phrase, if I heard the word correctly, that global simply meant you were covering everything about the healthcare and you weren't narrowly focusing on showing that it was the trial intervention that caused the injury. Was that a correct understanding? And can you just explain more about that program?
Sure. So I would say, yes, you are correct. It is not something where you basically have to prove that the injury was related to the study in order for it to be covered. And so in general, we're talking about any adverse event or injury that occurs during participation in the study. Otherwise, it would end up being a barrier to participation for approval, sometimes with ethical committees as well. And so it is more universal. That's the term, the meaning for the term global.
Can I flip this around then? We sometimes have concerns in U.S. research, not limited to pregnant and lactating persons, that people enter trials less than fully voluntarily because it is the one opportunity they would have to receive not just the health care that is specific to the trial, but the medical evaluation that goes into becoming a trial participant, where there is a general physical workup and so forth to see if there are any inclusion or exclusion criteria that become relevant. And what I would wonder, I believe you described the kind of insurance you were talking about as in relationship to the trial in Thailand, but perhaps it's just your general model around the world. Is there a concern that, given the fact that anytime any of us receive health care, there's a certain amount of inherent risk, if I'm in a situation particularly of being in a lower middle income country, don't have a lot of resources, the notion of getting my care in a trial might have the additional advantage that if anything happens to me while I'm getting my health care, not from the trial, care will be available that I might not have access to. Is that a concern, and how have you addressed it if it is a concern?
So it definitely is a concern, and it's not specific to trials involving pregnant women. And so we do often, as we design the trials, but also work with the local research investigators, we work to understand what is the local environment there, what is the system of incentives that might be in play with their population. Typically, though, we work with academic and government investigators who work in public hospitals or other institutions where care is provided for free already. And so there may not be a strong incentive. However, it does sometimes come up to discussion because the participants have a feeling of that they're being watched more closely, or that they might be getting better care otherwise. And so we work with the local investigators as well as their ethical committees to ensure that we don't basically have undue coercion because our incentive, in this case, medical care, is too much. So it's definitely an issue we deal with, but usually on a case by case basis, depending on the local context.
So generalizing that to the United States, we would have to recommend a system of universally public supported health care.
Well, I wouldn't go that far, and I don't touch the United States, so I don't do my research there. So I cannot comment.
Yeah, I could certainly add that, in addition, and I'm sure Dr. Butt, you do this as well, but there are, of course, the IRBs in the US where we're required to have a section in the informed consent form that says what is the benefit to the participant. And it's in that paragraph that we have to lay out what beyond standard of care they're expected to get. And that is reviewed by an independent board to determine if it's too much or too little.
And Dr. Gumazalo, would you like to add anything about the public-private partnerships that you mentioned? Would that be helpful?
Well, I think public-private partnerships in infectious diseases, neglected diseases, have generally been successful, and big pharmaceutical companies have invested in these trials and product development. So I think that's a good model that has been working in several areas, but it's not a universal blanket good because, for example, in the field of malaria, there are new anti-malarial medicines being developed, and some of these are having problems during pregnancy, that at least there is an anxiety that they may have harms. And the group that deals with this, Medicines for Malaria Venture, is struggling to get these drugs, the new drugs, which are much more effective, being tested in pregnant populations. And so I think there is a sort of a block when it comes to testing new drugs in pregnancy. And it's not really talked about a lot, except perhaps the HIV community, who has dealt with this in a very successful manner, because HIV community, I think, dealt with issues of both R&D and access perhaps better than other areas of healthcare. Thank you.
Thank you. I have Kavita, Mimi, and then an audience question. Nothing. Okay. Mimi.
So I wanted to drill down on the IRB question, because clearly you have IRBs that are now used to doing this type of research. So how do they actually think about the risk in a way that might be different than the way other IRBs here in the United States are frequently, well, I guess they're all in the United States, but IRBs that I have experience with are very, very risk averse in this context. So what are the questions that your IRBs are asking, or what are the way they think of risk and liability that might be different?
Obviously, the IRB's mandate is to protect the patient first and foremost, to make sure that there's not the undue coercion to participate in a clinical trial. So, and that the patients, of course, then would be safe. So there's safety measures in place in the study. One example I can raise, an element that I can't say that the IRB specifically asked about it, but one element that we often include in studies like this in populations of pregnancy and lactation is a safety monitoring committee. I think that goes a long way to mitigating risk, because we commit to reviewing safety events very frequently, and the frequency, of course, depends on the nature of the drug and the condition that we're treating. We also have committed, certainly in our earlier phase. So for example, this lactation program that we had we had done phase 1 work, but had committed to continuing that work into phase 2. So for example, it didn't just stop at phase 1. So we collected the data in phase 1 to show that the drug was not transferred into the breast milk, but again, made a commitment to continuing to explore that in a larger population in our phase 2 study. Trying to come back to the IRB and remember what else they may have asked about. But I mean, from my perspective, I think, and again, the experience I've had, it's setting the stage as a company in your early phase work to show a good safety profile that the IRB can then feel comfortable approving research like that because they know that patients are protected.
Perhaps I can jump in and just say, I mean, one of the things that we initially do when we consider doing a research study in a particular country or population is to determine whether that research is likely to provide benefit to that community. And so that's something the IRB, the local IRB, will also look at when they think of a risk-benefit balance. They will want to know, what is going to be the benefit here. And that usually involves an understanding of the burden of disease that our vaccine is trying to prevent. And so really, if it is something where they determine that there is a big enough benefit of this vaccine potentially in pregnant women, they're willing to consider that as part of their risk-benefit balance. And so understanding, that whether it's influenza or RSV or pertussis, that, understanding that that's a problem for their community, they may be more willing to accept the risks inherent in doing research in that population. It is important to recognize a couple of unique aspects. One is that vaccines have a different risk-benefit balance than drugs, because usually you're giving this to a person who's completely healthy, and it's to prevent the possibility of something happening, but you are giving potentially a real risk, concrete known risk, as in return for an expected benefit or a hypothetical benefit. So that's one reason why the tolerance of risk is higher or is lower, I guess you could say, for vaccines. The other is that the benefit, who does this vaccination of a pregnant woman benefit? Is it intended to benefit the woman herself, or is it to benefit the child? And so that can have some ethical implications that an IRB might want to wrestle with, especially with a vaccine against RSV or even pertussis, where the disease is very minimal in the mother, but can be quite serious in the infant. So those are some of the questions that we sometimes encounter with IRB reviews.
Dr. Gumazalo, were you interested in adding to that? I saw you had your hand up.
Yeah, before I joined Concept Foundation, I spent 21 years in WHO Reproductive Health and Research Department, and I had many unfavorable experiences with the WHO Ethics Review Committee. But I don't think this is something limited to WHO Ethics Committee, because we saw that in COVID vaccine and treatment trials, it existed in UK and other high-income country IRBs as well. The problem is risk aversion doesn't get rid of the risk. It just shifts the risk to another person, and that person is either the care provider or the pregnant person themselves. And in that sense, I think IRBs, at least, I don't know about the US IRBs, but definitely in LMICs, WHO, and Europe, I think they need training and education in terms of the risk-benefit assessments for trials that include pregnant persons, because it's not straightforward, it's simple, but risk aversion makes the problem bigger. Thank you.
Thank you for that. I have Sisi Ifinwa Kavita, and then we'll get to the audience question. Cece.
Great, thank you. So we've had some discussions in coffee breaks and all just about the difference in risk for pregnant persons being different from that for lactating persons. And that it was great to hear Lorian mention the phase 1 studies where for a new therapeutic, they did measure the levels of the drug or medication in the breast milk. And I would say that a majority of medications do not pass through to the breast milk. So the risk to the lactating person is potentially much lower for many medications that are like already on the market. But we don't have uniform data on that. Like as a clinician, you go to LacMed, and if I look up, I just looked up Zoloft, and there's like a handful of studies, 2 people, 5 people, like there's no good data source where we have that data of how much of these medications pass through to the breast milk, that it actually does pose a risk to the baby. So one way that actually Paul and I were discussing, as he has much FDA experience, is that, it's obviously done in some of these phase 1s in this new drug development, but could there be a mechanism by which a certain amount of testing is required to understand that so that that is done in a more uniform manner? Because pregnancy is challenging, more challenging, but at least lactation, if it doesn't pass to the breast milk, the risk to the baby is much lower. So that's just lower hanging fruit.
Thank you for that comment. Dr. Urban, did you want to add anything, or do you have any response?
Yeah, and I'm glad that you raised that comment about the difference in risk between pregnancy and lactation. I agree, they're quite different. One thing I would add is still the regulatory challenges, I think, that come even with lactation. So, for example, in our study, in our program that we did, we did, of course, a lot of preclinical work. We did the PK phase 1 that was required as well, showing that in our preclinical models, it was not transferred to the breast milk. That was not acceptable to FDA, and so we went on to do the human study, which wasn't the right thing to do, and I'm glad we did. I think you do have LacMed and sort of scalable, more straightforward options, I think, for lactation. So we were certainly thankful to partner with Dr. Hale to do our phase 1 study in milk transfer. And beyond that, again, still with lactation was the barrier of the safety follow-up. So there was still a request from FDA to follow the infants through to 2 years, which of course is I think it's needed still, especially with a new therapeutic. But again, coming to an agreement about what is an appropriate length of time for follow-up and when the results can be shared, again, instead of waiting all the way until the 2-year mark.
Thank you. Ifeanyi?
Thank you to all of the panelists. My question piggybacks off of Cece's and the comment that you just shared, Dr. Urban. Earlier today, we heard from one of the panelists that after FDA approval is received, it may, if additional research or studies are conducted, that may increase greater risk or liability for that institution or company or researcher. And so just piggybacking off of what you were sharing, I'm just curious in terms of during that product production or development, when FDA approval was received, and then they came back and said they wanted you to continue to follow the dyad for up to 2 years, were there discussions or concerns related to increased risk or liability for you all, you and your company, and how did you all mitigate or discuss those risks or liabilities or greater liabilities?
It's a good question. I think, again, the insurance policies are so standard in our industry that it just kind of comes with the territory. And I wouldn't say that there was an additional concern there. It was just the reality of this is what it takes to provide this therapy to the patients who need it. Whenever we're considering clinical trial or commercial product, once it's approved, we are always going to have the insurance policies, and they're going to be commensurate with the risk in terms of the length of exposure of the drug, the condition that's being treated, what the clinical trial looks like, what we're asking the participant to do. So all those factors kind of feed into essentially the end dollar amount of the insurance that's required to cover appropriately. Trying to think back, you had multiple components to that question, I think, and I may not have covered up everything, but.
No, I think you did. I think I've just been pondering during this whole discussion in terms of if there are situations or scenarios where it is advantageous and not a risk or concern for entities to do additional research that is needed and warranted, and to where that should happen versus concerns about taking on additional risk and liability. And so I think you did answer it in just given just additional food for thought in a sense in terms of the importance of it. But to your point, it sounds like you all have already built that in to the work that you're doing and into your insurance policies and practices. And correct me if I'm wrong, but that's what I'm hearing from you.
That's correct. I mean, some other thoughts, I suppose, that you inspired is that for companies, again, I do want to underscore that Ferring as a company, again, has this as a core of their mission. But I realize that not all companies have that. And so to do the phase 1 studies in humans and to undertake that could certainly be perceived as a risk. And so, just some question marks in my own mind is, are there other options? Is there a preclinical model that would give the medical community and the regulators assurance about safety? Is there even physiologically based PK modeling, which speaks to the availability of data and maybe pooling data across entities, companies, private, public, whomever, to characterize certain molecules and their PK profiles, and then, based on the mechanism of action, can we predict with enough assurance, I would say, that, what we can expect for any new entity that comes to market is of interest to me. We're certainly exploring those PBPK models for other products in our repertoire to see if we can expedite development.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, we have about 10 minutes left, and we have a lot of people lined up, so let's see if we can fit them all in. So Kavita, you're next.
Thank you. My question also is for Dr. Urban. Dr. Urban, I'm continuing the same line of conversation. I think there was a lot of hands that went up when you spoke, because I think you're our first guest today to speak on trials specifically in lactating people. And I think you touched on this a little bit with your answer to Dr. Lee, but I was hoping you could expound on it. I think, theoretically, this committee has sort of clinical, ethical, legal, regulatory expertise in some of the differences between pregnant and lactating people. But I certainly don't have the experience that you do on the issue. And so I'm curious if you could clarify some of the salient differences in your IRB experience, regulatory experience, liability issues when you're doing studies with your company on lactating people versus pregnant people.
I think that, it's a very insightful question, and your question is, what's the right word? It's this lack of understanding, I would say, is pervasive, because there is no difference in the questions that we're getting from regulators and from the IRBs in, either whether it's the regulator requiring certain elements of follow-up for both pregnancy and lactation, or the IRBs are asking the same questions. So I think, there's not a great distinction, I would say.
All right, thank you. Alex?
Metin reminded us of the costs of not doing the research. And we heard at the beginning of the day that trade-off between exposing the general population of pregnant and lactating women to a drug that hasn't been tested and transferring the risks to them versus having it borne through a research program by the research participants is not something, as he said, that we can leave to the jury system, because the jury doesn't know how to weigh the benefits of having had the research. And then we've heard from not from Lauren, but from other people from industry that the incentives aren't there for them to develop that knowledge. Is there a good locus for getting that balance made? In the vaccines area, which Metin was speaking of, we of course see everybody who participates in vaccination itself as doing something that might benefit them, which is true of research participants, but they're doing it in part because collectively we need widespread vaccination to actually provide the protection, not only for the vaccinated by reducing their risk of exposure, but for those who can't be vaccinated. And I wonder from all the panelists whether in working with companies and working with governments, in talking to the IRBs, or even in the consent process, that sense of you deserve something because you are in fact allowing a collective benefit to be produced, at what point can that trade-off and that recognition be made so we can get the adequate level of research? And it seemed to me that what Naranjan was saying was that with the global insurance, you try to do that because you say you're not going to be disadvantaged after the fact by having to prove that it was something about the drug that caused it. We're just going to put our thumbs on the scale and make the presumption that you should get coverage as a kind of reward for participating. And then we recognize that that can go too far. So where can we get this decision well made? We've heard certain things today that suggest government was clumsy and doesn't do it well, but I don't see where else that whole collective welfare can be taken into a balancing process. And so I realize this is more of a comment, but there's a question mark at the end. What does your experience add to our answering that question, that issue?
Yes, Dr. Gomazalo.
I have a couple of comments and suggestions, none of which are evidence-based at this point. But one thing is, I think a lot of pregnant persons, when asked, they do approach participating in trials and research altruistically. So I think they are not only participating to benefit themselves. And we don't know enough about care providers' attitudes and opinions, and women in different or pregnant persons in different contexts, in different cultures. So there, I think there's a research need. The second thing is, I think we need to acknowledge that there's a big gender bias as to why we are in this situation in 2023, that this issue has not been prioritized previously. And we need to generate demand from pregnant populations, from families, from care providers, that if they don't have the evidence, they should demand that evidence. And I think you are absolutely right. The governments should take the responsibility and provide the action. but they need to be made aware that this is an issue that they should care about.
To either of the other two panelists, would you like to add anything?
Yeah, I would add too, again, I think there's kind of two choices here, and I don't disagree that, regulation could be needed to mandate this type of research. So again, I think you can frame it as we need the research up front all the way through the development so that when a new product comes to market, it's all there and ready to go. But perhaps the balance comes at, that's obviously very costly and less of a return on investment. Doesn't mean it's not the right thing to do for patient, and we're all committed to doing that, certainly the right thing for patients. The second option is this notion of the post-marketing world and requiring a registry style surveillance of any new entity. And in that way, we can get the information that we need, albeit after the product is on the market. But it's much lower burden to do that kind of evidence generation than all the way through the development.
Yeah, and I would add, I think a lot of it has to do with the level of experience the regulator or the government has with this issue. And so when we go into lower income countries with a proposal for a trial in pregnant individuals, oftentimes there's a lot of education regarding the risks and the ethical considerations that has to happen. And I think as some regulatory agencies become more experienced, they can often set the standard for others. And so, for instance, South Africa has a lot of experience with HIV and TB medication research, and specifically with research in pregnant individuals. But India or China, they've also had to work out many of these issues from a regulatory aspect, and so they can often be a leader for other countries or a model for other countries in considering whether they want to support research in pregnant individuals or not. And so that's one of the enablers here, I think, for expanding research into other populations.
Thank you very much. I have a question from the audience. Real-world data is playing an increasing variety of roles in clinical research, including planning, designing, recruiting, and soliciting patient input for trials. Since real-world data collection is low risk and purely observational, could new approaches to real-world data studies with pregnant or lactating persons and their children help mitigate risk in interventional research? I open that up to anyone on the panel. We only have a few minutes left.
I love this question. And I think I agree. I think that the real world observational method of data collection can be a powerful tool to address the concern that is foremost in this committee's mind. And I'll leave it at that.
Great. I think you have some agreement on the committee. Did you want to add, Dr. Gulmazalo?
So I think real world experience evidence is very important and very useful, but I don't think that should be a replacement for real clinical trial data, because that is, I think, doing the things wrong way around. I think it's very important to get more quantified evidence on real-world implementation of innovations when they are introduced at scale. But I think that's answering a different question, and it shouldn't replace the rigorous trials during pregnancy and lactation.
Yeah, I would definitely echo what Metin is saying. It shouldn't be a replacement. And at least in the countries where PATH works, oftentimes the systems aren't in place to collect real world data. That often, requires, electronic medical records or a large insurance databases, a digital infrastructure that may not exist in those countries. But nevertheless, it is very important to understand how the vaccine or drug works in the real world, in the real world conditions where you don't have eligibility criteria for enrollment. You have people with a variety of conditions and who use the drug or vaccine in a variety of ways. And so you want to see that, but it's definitely something that shouldn't replace the sort of more formalized investigations.
Thank you, and I'm sorry to say that's the end of our opportunity to ask questions. We are at the end of the session. I want to thank all of our panelists today for taking the time and sharing their perspectives with the committee and with the audience. At the moment, I'm going to hand it over to Professor Riley.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for a very informative session. We really appreciate it. We're now going to move again back into the boardroom for closed session. And I think for that, I will discuss that in closed session. So consider this a chance for exercise, committee.
Yes, and to all of our virtual participants who have tuned in with us all day, we're extremely grateful, and we thank you for your questions and comments in the chat. Anything that we did not get to, we will discuss in closed session, so fear not, we will, that does inform our work, and we're really grateful to you all for joining us for this wonderful day, and thank you again to all of our speakers. And that will adjourn this workshop.
Thank you.
Thank you.